Some of the biggest names in rock history have battled drug addiction, spiraling into habits that consumed years, destroyed relationships, and in some cases, ended lives. The line between rock stardom and self-destruction has been crossed so many times that the two have become almost inseparable. These are 8 rock stars who went from performing in front of millions to fighting battles they could not win or barely survived. Let's start with a guitarist who, by all medical logic, should not still be alive. Keith Richards is alive. That statement on its own has baffled doctors, journalists, and fans for decades. The fact that Keith Richards is alive is nothing short of a miracle. The Rolling Stones guitarist consumed drugs for the better part of 40 years, survived 5 drug trials, and somehow kept making music that defined an entire era. And at one point, the story goes, he snorted his own father's ashes mixed with cocaine. Keith Richards, born 18th of December 1943, is an English musician, songwriter, singer, and record producer who is an original member, guitarist, secondary vocalist, and co-principal songwriter of the Rolling Stones. His songwriting partnership with the band's lead vocalist Sir Mick Jagger is one of the most successful in history. But beyond the riffs and the songwriting, Richards became known for something else entirely. Richards gained press notoriety for his romantic involvements and illicit drug use, and he was often portrayed as a countercultural figure. Richards didn't start out as a drug user. He was born in 1943 and grew up in post-war, post-bombed-out England. He didn't do drugs as a kid, nor did he drink excessively. The transition came slowly as the Stones gained fame and entered the orbit of international counterculture. When the Stones first came to America in the early 60s, Keith was barely out of his teens. The band was regarded as a white R&B or blues group, so that they often traveled with African-American musicians whom Keith idolized, and who introduced him to pot and to uppers for road trip performances. By the late 1960s, the substances escalated. He took to psychedelics like the rest of the rock and roll world, and then inhaled with the in-crowd internationally, and in Britain, he branched out to heroin and cocaine, leading to addiction. The irony was cruel. The deeper Keith sank into drugs, the more prolific his creative output became. Keith's drug habit progresses, but he moves into one of the most prolific writing periods of his career. He and Mick composed most of the songs for Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street, while Keith is under the influence. The legal consequences were relentless. Richards' notoriety for illicit drug use stems in part from several drug busts during the late 1960s and 1970s, and his candor about using heroin and other substances. Richards has been tried on drug-related charges 5 times, in 1967, twice in 1973, in 1977, and in 1978. The most dramatic of these came in 1977 in Canada, and charged him with possession of heroin for the purpose of trafficking. The charge was staggering. Richards was staring down a potential life sentence. His passport was confiscated, and Richards and his family remained in Toronto until remained in where his and right. Richards was allowed to enter the United States on a medical visa for treatment of heroin addiction, the case dragged on for 2 years. He was given a suspended sentence and put on probation for 1 year, with orders to continue treatment for heroin addiction and to perform a benefit concert on behalf of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, after a blind fan testified on his behalf. Meanwhile, he also watched the devastation of drugs on his own bandmate. Richards disproves the idea that seeing other people strung out motivates you to be clean. He performed an intervention for his first live-in girlfriend when she turned to serious drugs before he did, then watched Brian Jones self-destruct and die. And yet Keith proceeded merrily on his way to consume ever larger quantities of ever more serious substances. There were darker moments still. There were darker moments. Not only the death of user friends like Graham Parsons, but of his and Anita's, who shared Keith's drug tastes, 2-month-old son while Keith is away. Eventually, a turning point came, not from the law, not from tragedy, but from the music itself. More than anything, Keith became concerned when the serious drugs didn't work for the music anymore. Keith Richards had to quit heroin because it became incompatible with making music. In his own words, he laid out the timeline. I gave up heroin in 1978. I gave up cocaine in 2006. Doctors have struggled to explain how he survived. Whether it's genetic or because he's built up a tolerance, he does seem to have an unusually resilient constitution. Dr. Lefevre told BBC in 2010, "For every Keith Richards, there are many, many more who die." And then there's the story about his father. He's said to have snorted his dead father's ashes with a line of cocaine. He was cremated, and I couldn't resist grinding him up with a little bit of blow, Richards told NME magazine. Whether that's true, embellished, or a joke, it tells you everything about the mythology that Keith Richards built around himself, and the addiction that fueled it for decades. Ozzy Osbourne was fired from the band he helped create because drugs had made him impossible to work with. His addiction reached breaking point in 1979 when Ozzy was fired from the band for his unpredictable and violent behavior when inebriated, alongside his inconsistent performances. And that firing wasn't the end of his addiction story. It was closer to the beginning. Ozzy Osbourne is arguably the biggest rock and roll star that Birmingham has ever produced. The Prince of Darkness first rose to fame in 1968 as the lead singer of Black Sabbath, a band that helped pioneer the heavy metal genre. Cycling through almost every addictive drug there's a name for, Ozzy spent most of the period between 1967 and 2006 living in a blur of heavy use. Jail time, inpatient care facilities, and continued use. Ozzy's relationship with substances began before fame ever entered the equation. Ozzy grew up a highly anxious person and often turned to drink so he could feel more comfortable in his own body. He was also brought up in the heavy drinking, working-class culture of England in the 1960s, where spending evenings at the local pub and drinking to excess became commonplace for him. The drugs followed the success. Osbourne's first experience with cocaine occurred in the early 1970s in Denver, Colorado, after a Black Sabbath show. Reflecting on that moment, Osbourne said, "The first time I tried cocaine, I remember thinking, I've found the meaning of life." During the recording of Black Sabbath Vol. 4 in 1972, it's estimated that the band spent $75,000 on drugs, more than the $65,000 it cost to record the album. They wanted to call the album Snowblind, but their label vetoed the idea. By 1979, even the other members of Black Sabbath had had enough. Ozzy was unceremoniously fired from the band and paid out a few $100,000 to settle his contract. He reacted to the firing by sealing himself inside a hotel suite for 3 months and spending it all on drugs and parties. Sharon Osbourne, who would later become his wife and manager, pulled him from the brink and helped launch a solo career. At the urging of his future wife, Sharon, Ozzy Osbourne launched a solo career later that year. But the solo career didn't stop the addiction. Somehow, accelerating his drug use throughout the 1980s, Ozzy managed to get arrested and banned from the city of San Antonio for urinating on a memorial to fallen veterans of the Alamo. The toll on his family was immense. At age 13, Kelly was prescribed Vicodin for tonsillitis and began using it recreationally. She went to rehab for the first time in 2004 at age 17. As a teen, Jack started drinking to escape feelings of depression, but had trouble telling his parents that alcohol had become a problem. Even during the filming of the family's reality show, The Osbournes, Ozzy says he spent nearly every day of filming stoned from 2002 to 2005. Recovery was not a straight line for Ozzy. Despite multiple stints in rehab, he relapsed several times. But eventually something shifted. Ozzy got sober in 2014 and seemed to stay that way through the remainder of his life. In his final years, he celebrated the release of his 2020 album Ordinary Man, which Osbourne describes as the first album he ever co-wrote and recorded completely sober. Ozzy Osbourne died on July 22, 2025 from a heart attack, with coronary artery disease and Parkinson's disease listed as contributing factors. He once said in 1997, "With the amount of poison that I put through my body over the years, I should have been dead 1,000 times." Kurt Cobain was 27 years old when he died. On or around April 5, 1994, Kurt Cobain died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, with a lethal dose of heroin in his blood. The biggest rock star in the world was gone, and heroin had been with him every step of the descent. Kurt Cobain, born on February 20, 1967, was the influential frontman of the iconic rock band Nirvana, which played a pivotal role in the rise of grunge music. His early life was marked by familial instability, with his parents divorcing when he was 7, leading to a tumultuous childhood. Cobain developed a passion for music and art, ultimately dropping out of high school to pursue his musical ambitions. But the story of Cobain's addiction didn't start with fame. It started with pain, both emotional and physical. It would be a massive understatement to say that Kurt's life was riddled with dysfunction, violence, and emotional suffering. He suffered from anxiety and depression, and of course was highly addicted to heroin. Kurt's initiation into marijuana usage likely began around 1980 at the age of 13. By 16, he had established a routine of consuming marijuana, alcohol, and cigarettes. Concurrently, he engaged in more perilous substances, including solvent huffing with runaways and homeless peers. By the age of 19, Kurt claimed to have experimented with virtually every drug out there. The heroin came in 1986. Cobain first took heroin in 1986, administered to him by a dealer in Tacoma, Washington, who had previously supplied him with oxycodone and aspirin. Cobain used heroin sporadically for several years. By the end of 1991, his use had developed into addiction. The catalyst was chronic stomach pain. Throughout much of his life, Cobain was plagued with chronic stomach ailments. Despite many attempts to solve the medical problem, he was unable to remedy the persistent pain, claiming it was the only drug that could alleviate his stomach pains. Accordingly, he developed a severe heroin addiction. In his own unsent letter to fans from 1992, Cobain wrote, "So after protein drinks, becoming a vegetarian exercise, stopping smoking, and doctor after doctor, I decided to relieve my pain with small doses of heroin." He framed it as a temporary fix. It became a life sentence. By 1992, Kurt Cobain, a former homeless street kid, had virtually unlimited access to any drug he wanted. The overdoses started stacking up. The morning after the band's performance on Saturday Night Live in 1992, Cobain experienced his first near-death overdose after injecting heroin. Love resuscitated him. Prior to a performance at the New Music Seminar in New York City on July 23, 1993, Cobain suffered another overdose. Rather than calling for an ambulance, Love injected Cobain with naloxone to resuscitate him. Cobain proceeded to perform with Nirvana, giving the public no indication that anything had happened. By March 1994, Love had seen Kurt close to death from heroin overdoses on more than a dozen occasions, according to biographer Charles Cross. The band tried to hold things together, but the addiction was tearing everything apart. As Cobain's addiction worsened, the disruptions to Nirvana's touring and live performances also intensified. The lead singer's overdoses and related health issues led to show cancellations, impaired performances, and backstage conflicts with managers. These dynamics also inevitably created friction within the band. Bandmate Chris Novoselic tried to warn Cobain repeatedly. Novoselic said he had tried warning Cobain about heroin and encouraging him to quit multiple times, and that there were long-standing tensions in their relationship as a result. The 1994 European tour was a disaster. Kurt Cobain's drug use was accelerating, and he arrived for every show drunk and high on a variety of substances. In Germany on March 1, the band played its last complete live show. On March 4th, Cobain overdosed on a combination of alcohol and Rohypnol in a hotel room in Rome. After an intervention on March 25th, Cobain agreed to enter rehab in Los Angeles. After an intervention by Courtney Love and a number of close friends and colleagues, Kurt agreed to go into rehab in Los Angeles. But it didn't last. Cobain flew back to Seattle, where his body was found at his home on 8th April. The cause of death was given as suicide. Close friends, reflecting on Kurt Cobain's life after his untimely demise, revealed that his death was not an isolated or unforeseen incident. His inner circle had witnessed his turbulent journey through periods of intense drug use, with the final days marked by a palpable desperation. The voice of a generation was silenced at 27, consumed by the same substance he once thought would save him from pain. Part 4. Nikki Sixx declared dead and back for more. On December 23, 1987, Nikki Sixx's heart stopped beating. Sixx overdosed on heroin multiple times in the 80s, most famously on December 23, 1987, when he was declared clinically dead for 2 minutes before being revived. And then, in a move that defied every instinct of self-preservation, he went home and used heroin again. In the 1980s, Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue battled addictions to heroin, cocaine, and alcohol, after heavily engaging in drug use early in his career. The bass player and primary songwriter of one of the biggest glam metal bands in history had built his life around excess, and the excess nearly killed him twice in one night. The story of that fateful December evening has been retold many times. After a night of drug-fueled partying with pals, including Guns N' Roses members Slash and Steven Adler, and Rat's Robin Crosby, Sixx was injected with one last syringe of heroin and promptly passed out cold. The paramedics were called. News spread quickly. Amid this pandemonium, word leaked to radio and other band members that Sixx had died. In the Heroin Diaries, Vince Neil recalled being devastated. Maybe deep down I knew it was going to happen one day. Sixx was resuscitated and regained consciousness, but what he did next remains one of the most disturbing details in rock history. 2 minutes later, he regained consciousness after receiving 2 shots of adrenaline. He immediately went home, used more heroin, and passed out. Before the overdose, cocaine had already pushed Sixx to the edge. The bassist said that cocaine caused him to experience psychosis on Christmas Day in 1986. If you shoot enough cocaine, you go into a kind of psychosis, and I believed people were coming to get me, Sixx told The Guardian. But the near-death experience did something to Sixx that all the warnings and chaos hadn't managed. He later said, "My heart stopped for 2 minutes, and I came back. I went home and I shot up again and overdosed again. And I woke up the next day and I kind of had a spiritual awakening. Because I woke up and it was the first time I didn't want to do drugs." After being declared clinically dead, he was revived by cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The incident inspired Motley Crue's 1989 hit Kickstart My Heart. He would go on to use drugs periodically until 2001, when he gave them up for good. 6 years later, he wrote about his descent into heroin addiction in his book, The Heroin Diaries, A Year in the Life of a Shattered Rock Star. Today, there was a time when no one would have imagined that Nikki Sixx would be one of music's leading recovery spokespersons and advocates. But now that Sixx has been clean for nearly 20 years, he has made it his mission to help other addicts. Part 5. Eric Clapton. Slow hands, $16,000 a week habit. Eric Clapton covered himself in glory as one of the greatest guitar players in history. Then he nearly buried himself in heroin. His career threatened to collapse in the early 70s after his time with the Dominoes came to an end. That supergroup fell apart due to the excessive use of drugs among members of the group. Unfortunately, Clapton was one of them. He fell under the influence of heroin and disappeared from the rock scene for years as he fought it off. Few guitarists have had the type of acclaimed and lengthy career as Eric Clapton. From his early days playing blues with the Yardbirds, through his psychedelic period with Cream, the heart-wrenching romanticism of Derek and the Dominos, and his own lengthy and diverse career, Clapton has maintained a constant presence in the music world. But the heroin years were devastating. He sang about cocaine, but that's not the only drug Slowhand fell victim to. His $16,000 a week heroin habit almost drove him to suicide, but he never did it because then he'd have to stop drinking. That dark irony that he couldn't kill himself because he was too addicted to alcohol to go through with it paints a vivid picture of how entwined his addictions had become. In the 80s, Clapton was in the midst of his most vicious season and seemed to spend up to $15,000 a week in alcohol and drugs. He vanished from public life. Concerts stopped, records stopped. The man they called God on London walls in the 1960s was living as a recluse, consumed by heroin. It was his friend Pete Townsend of The Who refused to let him disappear. While many of his friends wrote him off as a junkie, His friend Pete Townshend helped Clapton through the difficult rehabilitation process and set up a major comeback concert at the Rainbow Theatre in London in 1973. The road back was long and winding, and it wasn't a clean break. Clapton replaced heroin with alcohol, which brought its own disasters. Car crashes, health crises, and performing while lying on the ground because he couldn't stand up. After withdrawing from his career, enduring car crashes, health problems, and being so drunk he'd perform lying down, Clapton finally reached that crossroads and sobered up. A transformative moment came in 1987. The birth of his son, Connor, in 1987 led him to change his life, committing to being sober for his child. The premature and upsetting death of the child, who fell from the skyscraper where he lived with his mother, risked bringing him back to old drug issues, but Clapton found in the tragedy the strength to be permanently away from drugs. Deciding not to disappoint Connor's memory, Clapton credited his continued sobriety to his music and spirituality. He wrote "Tears in Heaven," a song about his loss that became one of his most famous songs. He went on to found a rehabilitation center in Antigua called Crossroads, dedicated to helping others fight the same battle he nearly lost. The man who almost drowned in heroin eventually pulled others from the water. Part 6. Steven Tyler, the Toxic Twin. Steven Tyler once said he snorted his Porsche, he snorted his plane, and he snorted his house. He said, "I blew 20 million. I snorted my Porsche, I snorted my plane, I snorted my house." In that din of drugs and booze and being lost, that is not metaphor. That is a man describing how his cocaine and heroin addiction consumed every material possession he'd earned through one of the most successful careers in rock history. Aerosmith lead singer Steven Tyler was so infamous for his troubled history with drug addiction that he and his guitarist Joe Perry were given the nickname the Toxic Twins. At the peak of Aerosmith's mid to late 1970s success, Tyler was pouring money into drugs at a staggering rate. In interviews, Tyler has mentioned he first began drinking in his teenage years to cope with his insecurities. However, his fame as Aerosmith's lead singer gave him access to the huge drug culture of the 1970s, and with it, an addiction to cocaine. He has said in interviews that he spent at least $20 million during the course of his drug addiction. The impact on the band was direct and measurable. As a result of all this drug use, Tyler and Perry ended up struggling to maintain their early career momentum. After the success of Toys in the Attic and Rocks, their albums sold fewer and fewer copies, and soon they had run out of money. The music suffered because the drugs took everything: the money, the focus, the will to create. The intervention came in 1986. His bandmates staged an intervention in 1986, and Tyler remained sober for nearly 20 years before relapsing on painkillers after serious back surgery in 2006. That relapse is one of the more painful twists in the story. A man who had conquered 2 decades of sobriety undone by a legitimate medical procedure that reintroduced opioids into his system. Sadly, Tyler struggled for years with heroin addiction and would often relapse. However, with continued persistence and support from his loved ones, he lives a sober life. Tyler and Perry have been clean ever since they finished rehab. They returned in the 80s with a more commercial-oriented sound that drew in millions of new fans and helped sustain their career for almost 3 decades. Tyler's story is the classic arc of an addict who lost everything, clawed it all back, nearly lost it again, and somehow held on. Part 7. Stevie Nicks, the hole in her nose. Stevie Nicks was told by a doctor in 1986 that if she used cocaine one more time, it would kill her. Nicks' 9-year dependence on the drug would have eventually killed her had she not heeded the warning from a doctor in 1986 that her drug use had burned a hole in her nose, and that any more cocaine would most likely be fatal. Stevie Nicks is one of the most successful rock stars of all time. As the frontwoman of Fleetwood Mac and a powerful solo artist, she defined an era with songs that are still ubiquitous decades later. But behind the shawls and the gold dust, there was a cocaine habit that nearly erased her entirely. Nicks stated in an interview with writer Brian Hyatt that early life in the band was dangerous. The amount of cocaine being consumed was very much out of control. In the world of 1970s and 1980s rock, cocaine was everywhere. But Nicks went further than most. A 9-year dependency on the drug caused enough physical damage to burn through the cartilage of her nose. Her close friend Tom Petty didn't mince words about how bad it was. Her close friend Tom Petty told Rolling Stone, "I was very worried about her, to the point that if the phone did ring and they said, 'Stevie died,' I wouldn't have been surprised." But quitting cocaine in 1986 wasn't the end of Nix's ordeal. In many ways, it was the beginning of a new chapter of addiction that was arguably worse. Nix's treatment for cocaine addiction was only a prelude to a far more debilitating addiction to Klonopin. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, prescribed by another doctor to keep the singer off cocaine. The cruel irony, the medication prescribed to treat her drug addiction became its own prison. The Klonopin, a benzodiazepine, trapped Nix in a haze for years, robbing her of time, creativity, and memory. After beating her addiction to cocaine in the 80s, Stevie got hooked on the prescription drug Klonopin. Her addiction was well known and widely covered. She kicked that habit in the mid-90s and has been sober ever since. Nix has described the Klonopin years as worse than the cocaine years, a drawn-out fog that stole nearly a decade of her life. The story of Stevie Nicks is a reminder that addiction doesn't always come from a dealer on a street corner. Sometimes it comes from a doctor's prescription pad. Lane Staley was found dead in his Seattle apartment on April 19, 2002. Investigation revealed that he had passed away on April 5, 2002, exactly 8 years after Kurt Cobain's death. Staley overdosed on a speedball, a deadly combination of heroin and cocaine, at the age of 34. At the time of his death, Staley weighed just under 90 pounds, marking the tragic end of a long, sorrowful, and painful journey of drug abuse. As the lead singer of Alice in Chains, Staley was one of the defining voices of the Seattle grunge movement. Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden emerged as icons, their raw sound echoing the disillusionment and alienation felt by millions. But heroin consumed him completely, pulling him from public life and into years of total isolation. The harsh realities of drug use deeply impacted Staley's life, a journey that began during his youth. At first, Staley approached drugs with a sense of optimism, experiencing what could be described as the honeymoon phase, where he felt invincible. His lyrics often delved into drug culture, capturing its allure and the lifestyle associated with it. As time progressed, Staley confronted the brutal truths of addiction, the relentless grip that slowly strips away an individual's humanity. Alice in Chains music became a direct reflection of Staley's descent. Songs like Down in a Hole, Wood, and Junkhead chronicled the pull and destruction of addiction with an honesty that was almost unbearable. The band's MTV Unplugged performance in 1996, a show that has since become legendary, displayed a visibly frail Staley, struggling to keep his balance, his voice somehow still piercing through the fog of deterioration. After that performance, Staley essentially vanished. He withdrew from friends, from music, from the outside world. He remained in his apartment for years, his only companion the needle. Late Alice in Chains singer Lane Staley's mother has spoken in the past about times. Lane wanted to get out of his record contract and get clean, but his label wouldn't release him from his contract. The industry that built him up also, in some ways, held him in place while he crumbled. The date of his death, April 5th, the same date as Kurt Cobain's, was a coincidence so tragic it reads like fiction. Two of grunge's most important voices, both taken by heroin, on the same calendar date 8 years apart. At 90 pounds, Staley's body had been ravaged beyond recognition. He had died approximately 2 weeks before anyone found him. That's how isolated he had become, the frontman of a platinum-selling rock band alone in a room with no one coming to check. Lane Staley's story is the starkest illustration of what drug addiction does. When there is no intervention, no rescue, no moment of clarity. Some stories don't have a recovery chapter. Some stories end in a room alone at 90 pounds with a needle. 8 rock stars. 8 encounters with addiction that reshaped or destroyed their lives. Keith Richards somehow survived decades of heroin and cocaine use. Ozzy Osbourne spent 40 years cycling through every drug known to medicine. Kurt Cobain used heroin to numb physical and emotional pain and never found a way out. Nikki Sixx literally died and came back. Eric Clapton vanished from music for years. Steven Tyler burned through $20 million. Stevie Nicks had a hole burned through her nose. And Lane Staley wasted away to nothing in total isolation. Because of the nature of the rock industry, artists are touring constantly, which means they have no set sleeping patterns. Often, rockers turn to alcohol and drugs to self-medicate a mental illness to cope. The pattern is the same over and over. Early exposure, escalation, destruction, and then either recovery or death. The ones who survived did so because someone intervened, or because they finally reached a point where the drug stopped working for whatever purpose they had originally served. The ones who didn't survive remind us that addiction doesn't care how famous you are, how talented you are, or how many albums you've sold. These 8 stories are cautionary tales written in cocaine, heroin, and whiskey. They are also, for some, stories of resilience. But either way, they are reminders that the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll was never a lifestyle. It was a warning.